It started as a simple trip. I was 16, and my Uncle Sam had invited me on a weekend camping trip deep in the woods of Wyoming. He was the kind of guy who knew everything about survival, how to pitch a tent, cook over an open flame, and identify tracks of animals. I admired him for it, and I figured I'd learn a thing or two about the outdoors. We drove for hours in his old pickup truck, the kind that rattled like it might fall apart on every bump. The plan was to camp near an isolated creek he'd visited years ago. No cell service, no marked trails, just nature. As we left the dirt road and began hiking toward the site, the world became quieter. Even the wind seemed muffled by the thick canopy of pine and fir. When we arrived, the creek looked peaceful, the water clear enough to see smooth stones beneath its surface. We set up camp a few yards away. Uncle Sam handed me a hatchet and told me to gather firewood while he prepared the site. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped fast. By the time we had a fire going, the forest was dark. Stars speckled the sky, and the only sound was the gentle trickle of the creek. We roasted some hot dogs, ate quietly, and stared into the flames. That's when I first noticed it. An odd feeling, like being watched. I didn't say anything, chalking it up to nerves. After all, I wasn't used to being so far from civilization. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, peering into the trees. Uncle Sam didn't seem to notice anything unusual. We turned in early, each of us in our own tent. I lay there listening to the forest, trying to pick out the familiar sounds of nature. Crickets, the occasional rustle of leaves. But there was something else, something faint. A soft, distant sound, almost like a person calling out. At first, I thought it might be another camper. But who else would be this deep in the woods? The sound came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, but it didn't make sense. The words were garbled, like someone speaking a language I didn't know. I froze, straining to listen. The voice sounded closer now, weaving through the trees. Then it stopped. For the next few minutes, I lay there, heart pounding, ears tuned to every noise. I told myself it was nothing, maybe the wind playing tricks. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, Uncle Sam acted like everything was normal. He cooked breakfast over the fire, cracking jokes about how lazy I was for sleeping in. I didn't mention the voice. Maybe I'd imagined it. We spent the day hiking and fishing, and for a while, I forgot about the night before. By the time we got back to camp, I felt more relaxed. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. That night, the feeling returned. It started with the same unease, a sense that we weren't alone. The forest seemed too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I caught myself glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see someone or something watching. When we went to bed, I couldn't sleep. The voice came again, faint at first but growing louder. This time it sounded closer, clearer. It was mimicking my uncle's voice. "Help!" it called, the tone uneven, like it was struggling to form the word. "Help me." Chills ran down my spine. I knew Uncle Sam was in his tent, just a few feet away. But the voice, it was identical to his except for that strange, distorted quality. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim red glow. The trees beyond were pitch black. And then I saw movement. A shape emerged from the darkness, tall and thin. At first, I thought it was Uncle Sam, but the way it moved was wrong, jerky, almost unnatural. It stepped closer to the firelight, and I realized it wasn't him. Its body looked human, but the proportions were off. The arms were too long, the shoulders too narrow. The face, I don't even know how to describe it. It was like someone had tried to copy a human face but got it wrong. Called out again, the same distorted voice. "Help me." I ducked back into my tent, heart hammering. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it some kind of animal? A person playing a cruel joke? I didn't know. The voice came again, louder now. "Help me!" I heard the zipper of my uncle's tent. He must have woken up. I stayed perfectly still, listening as he stepped out. "What the hell?" I heard him mutter. His voice was steady, calm. Typical Uncle Sam. Then silence. I wanted to call out to him, but fear kept me frozen. Minutes passed, and the only sound was the creak. Finally, I heard his footsteps returning. "Go back to sleep," he said, his voice low. The next morning, Uncle Sam was quiet. He didn't mention anything about the night before, and I didn't ask. We packed up camp and started the long hike back to the truck. It wasn't until we were halfway home that he spoke. "Don't tell anyone about this," he said, his eyes fixed on the road. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. He hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "There's things in these woods that don't want to be found. You hear something, you see something, you keep walking. Understand?" I nodded, my mouth dry. We didn't talk for the rest of the drive. I haven't been camping since. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that thing in the woods, the way it tried to mimic my uncle's voice, the way it watched us from the shadows. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. What I do know is this: some places aren't meant to be explored, and some things aren't meant to be understood. And if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, far from anyone or anything, and you hear a voice calling out to you, don't answer. The air was crisp and cold when I arrived at the clearing in the woods. It had been a last-minute decision to go camping alone. I wanted some solitude, away from the suffocating noise of the city. This wasn't my first time camping, but it was my first time in this particular area. The forest was dense, and the trees loomed tall, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. I chose a spot near a small stream where the gurgling water offered a sense of peace. It was late afternoon when I set up my tent and gathered firewood. The sun was already sinking, casting long shadows through the trees. I kept telling myself that I had nothing to fear. I had checked the weather, packed enough supplies, and brought a map and compass. It was supposed to be a quiet night, just me and the woods. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest came alive with sounds. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled, and distant howls echoed faintly. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of canned beans and bread, savoring the warmth of the flames. The firelight flickered against the trees, creating moving shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Around 9 p.m., the forest seemed to grow quieter. The crickets stopped their chirping, and the rustling leaves fell silent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. I tried to focus on the fire, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then, I heard it, a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. I froze, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The sound came again, closer this time. It was deliberate, unlike the random noises of animals moving through the brush. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound, but the beam revealed nothing but trees and undergrowth. A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't easily scared, but there was something about the stillness that unnerved me. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. After all, I was in their territory. I tried to ignore it and went back to the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was close to midnight when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved at the edge of the firelight. I turned my head sharply, but whatever it was had already disappeared into the shadows. My heart pounded as I scanned the tree line, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. And then I saw it, a deer. At first, I felt a wave of relief. Its silhouette stood just beyond the reach of the firelight, motionless, staring at me. but something about it was wrong. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, with patches of fur missing from its sides. Its legs were unnaturally long, bending at odd angles as it stood there, unblinking. But it was the eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. They didn't reflect the light like most animals' eyes would. Instead, they seemed to absorb it, two dark voids that bored into me. I tried to convince myself it was just a sick deer. Maybe it had mange or some other disease. But as I watched it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't right. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, not moving, not making a sound. I decided to scare it off. Grabbing a stick from the fire, I waved it in the air, shouting, "Get out of here!" The deer didn't flinch. It didn't react at all. It just stood there, staring. My pulse quickened. Finally, I threw the stick in its direction. The glowing ember landed a few feet from it, but the deer didn't move. Instead, it slowly tilted its head, as if studying me. The motion was unnaturally smooth, almost mechanical. I backed away toward my tent, never taking my eyes off the deer. My instincts screamed at me to get inside and zip up the flap, but I couldn't turn my back on it. I reached the tent and quickly slipped inside, fumbling with the zipper. Inside, I sat with my flashlight clutched tightly in my hand, listening. The forest was silent again, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I told myself it was just a deer, a sick and strange-looking deer, but I couldn't shake the unease. Minutes passed, then hours. I didn't sleep. I kept the flashlight pointed at the tent flap, my ears straining for any sound. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. It was closer this time. My heart raced as I held my breath, waiting. The sound stopped right outside the tent. I could hear it breathing, slow and heavy. I didn't dare move. The air inside the tent felt suffocating, and my hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight. And then, something pressed against the fabric of the tent. I could see its outline, a long, thin face and those impossibly long legs. It leaned in closer, sniffing the fabric. My stomach churned as I fought the urge to scream. It stayed there for what felt like an eternity before slowly backing away. I listened as its footsteps grew fainter, disappearing into the woods. Even then, I didn't move. I stayed frozen in place until the first light of dawn seeped through the fabric of the tent. When I finally mustered the courage to step outside, the clearing was empty. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was eerily quiet. But then I saw the tracks. They weren't deer tracks. They were too large, too irregular. The ground was disturbed in a way that didn't make sense, as if whatever had been there had dragged its legs or stumbled. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I threw my gear into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors. As I started the engine and pulled onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the woods, was the deer. It stood just as it had the night before, motionless, watching me. I pressed down on the gas and didn't look back. I haven't been camping since that night. I've told myself it was just a sick animal, that my mind played tricks on me in the dark. But deep down, I know it was something else, something I can't explain. And sometimes, late at night, I dream about those eyes, those dark, empty eyes, and I wake up with the feeling that I'm still being watched. It was late October when I decided to go camping alone. I had always loved the outdoors, the crisp air, the smell of pine trees, and the quiet nights were what I lived for. My friends thought it was weird, but I enjoyed the solitude. This time, I chose a remote area I'd never been to before. It was an old trail that hadn't been used in years, deep in the woods about an hour's drive from town. I arrived late in the afternoon, parked my truck at the edge of the forest, and began the hike to my chosen spot. I had scouted the area on a map and picked a clearing near a small stream. It seemed perfect, far away from the noise of civilization. The hike itself was uneventful. I followed the trail as it wound through the trees, the sun dipping lower and lower until the light was golden and soft. When I reached the clearing, I was satisfied with my choice. It was spacious but surrounded by thick trees on all sides, making it feel secluded. The stream was close enough to hear the gentle flow of water, and there was plenty of flat ground to pitch my tent. I set up camp quickly, arranging my gear and lighting a small fire as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. The temperature dropped fast, and soon, I was bundled up in a jacket, staring into the flames. The forest was eerily quiet. It wasn't uncommon for nights to be silent in the wilderness, but this felt different. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hoot of an owl. Just the crackling of my fire and the soft burble of the stream. It made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. The quiet could have been due to the cold weather. I ate a quick dinner and decided to turn in early. The hike had been tiring, and I wanted to be up with the sunrise to explore the area. After extinguishing the fire, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up. My sleeping bag was warm and comfortable, and I quickly drifted off. I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the soft murmur of the stream. A faint, rhythmic crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started pounding as I lay still, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't consistent, though. Sometimes there were several steps in quick succession, other times long pauses between them. I told myself it was probably an animal, deer maybe, or a raccoon, but the longer I listened, the more it sounded off. Animals don't walk like that. They don't stop and start like a person sneaking around. I stayed frozen, my breath shallow. The steps circled my tent, crunching the leaves just outside. Whoever or whatever it was didn't make a sound other than the footsteps. No muttering, no sniffing, nothing. Just those deliberate, shuffling steps. I grabbed the flashlight I had left next to my sleeping bag and turned it on. The inside of the tent lit up, casting shadows on the walls. The steps stopped abruptly. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, just as I started to think it was gone, I heard something. A low, raspy breathing. It was close, too close. My chest tightened as I realized it was coming from right outside the thin fabric of my tent. I mustered the courage to call out, "Hello? Who's there?" No response. The breathing continued for a few more seconds, then stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Suddenly, the side of the tent caved in slightly, as if something had pressed against it. I scrambled backward, my heart racing. I pointed the flashlight at the spot, but it was just the fabric of the tent, bulging inward slightly. And then it was gone. The footsteps resumed, this time moving away from the tent. I stayed inside, too scared to move, until the sound faded into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked normal at first glance, but as I looked closer, I noticed footprints in the dirt. They weren't boot prints, though. They were strange, long, narrow, and uneven, like they had been made by someone walking on the balls of their feet. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking. I wanted to be out of there as soon as possible. As I hiked back to my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me. But the forest was as silent as it had been the night before. When I reached the truck, I threw my gear into the back and climbed in. As I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced into the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall and skinny, with pale skin that almost blended into the gray light of the morning. Its face was shadowed, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking. I floored the gas pedal, my heart pounding. When I looked back again, it was gone. I never went back to that forest. Whatever I encountered that night wasn't something I could explain, and I didn't want to try. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the strange footprints were just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the sound of those footsteps and the way the tent had caved in, as if something had been watching me. And every time I do, I feel that same cold gaze, as if it's still out there, waiting. But I never look back. I started the trip with high hopes. A weekend alone in the woods was exactly what I needed. I had my tent, my supplies, and my favorite book packed tightly into my old hiking backpack. After weeks of staring at computer screens and shuffling through the mundane rhythm of daily life, the idea of disconnecting from everything and being surrounded by nothing but trees and silence seemed perfect. The campsite I chose was a bit off the beaten path. It wasn't one of those crowded spots with RVs and kids on bicycles. This was real wilderness, about a 2-hour hike from the nearest trailhead. I wanted solitude, and this spot promised it. The hike in was uneventful. The sun was out, the air was crisp, and the forest felt alive in a way that made me feel calmer than I had in weeks. Birds flitted between the branches, and the occasional squirrel scampered across the path ahead of me. By the time I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows between the trees. I set up my tent quickly and gathered some firewood before it got too dark. The sounds of the forest changed as night fell. The chirping of birds gave way to the high-pitched songs of crickets, and somewhere in the distance, a barred owl hooted softly. I built a fire, cooked some instant noodles, and leaned back against a log, staring up at the stars. The quiet was everything I'd hoped for at first, but as the night deepened, the silence began to feel heavy. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet I'd been craving. It was the kind that pressed down on you, making every little sound feel amplified. The crackling of the fire, the rustling of the wind through the trees, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the distance. They all felt louder and closer than they should have. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I wasn't used to being out here alone. I stayed up a little while longer, trying to lose myself in the book I'd brought, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Eventually, I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly. The forest doesn't sleep, not really. Even with the fire out and my eyes closed, I could hear the world around me. Crickets chirped steadily, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't alone out here, even if the company was just wildlife. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was awake again, staring into the dark with a sudden jolt of awareness. Something had changed. Took me a moment to realize what it was. The crickets had stopped chirping. The night was completely still. I held my breath, straining my ears for any sound, and then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps just outside my tent. They weren't the quick, scuttling movements of an animal or the light patter of a raccoon. These steps were slow, measured, like someone or something was carefully placing each foot down to avoid making noise. My heart pounded as I lay there, frozen. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay still. The steps circled my tent once, then stopped. For what felt like hours, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the oppressive silence pressing in on me. Then, a low, guttural growl broke the stillness. It wasn't like a dog's bark or the yelp of a coyote. It was deeper, rougher, and much closer than I wanted it to be. My breath caught in my throat. The growl came again, longer this time, and I could hear the sound of something sniffing at the fabric of my tent. I told myself it was just an animal, a curious stray dog, maybe, or a wolf. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew that wasn't right. Wolves don't usually wander this far south, and I hadn't seen any signs of other campers with dogs on my hike in. The growling stopped abruptly, and for a moment, I thought it was gone. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against the ground, followed by the faint rustle of something brushing against the tent wall. Whatever it was still there, and it was too close for comfort. I reached for my flashlight with trembling hands, careful not to make any noise. Slowly, I unzipped the side pocket of my sleeping bag, trying to stay as quiet as possible. When my fingers finally closed around the cool metal of the flashlight, I hesitated. Shining a light might scare it off, or it might make things worse. Before I could decide, the growling started again, louder this time, and accompanied by a sharp, barking sound that made my skin crawl. My hand shot to the zipper of the tent, and in one swift motion, I yanked it down and shone the flashlight outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on a figure just a few feet away. It was a dog, at least it looked like one, but something about it was off. Its fur was matted and patchy, with raw, red patches of skin showing through in places. Its eyes reflected the light in an eerie, almost unnatural way, and its body was gaunt, as if it hadn't eaten in weeks. It stared at me, unblinking, its lips pulled back to reveal yellowed, broken teeth. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it let out a snarl and lunged forward, stopping just short of the tent's opening. I scrambled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. As it pawed at the ground, its movements erratic and almost unnatural. I shouted, trying to scare it off, but the sound only seemed to agitate it further. It barked again, the sound sharp and grating, and started circling the tent. I could hear its claws scraping against the ground as it moved, its low growl never stopping. I had to do something. Grabbing the small hatchet I'd brought for chopping firewood, I unzipped the tent's side door just enough to stick my arm out. I waved the hatchet wildly, yelling as loudly as I could, hoping to scare it off. The dog stopped in its tracks, its head snapping toward the movement. It bared its teeth again, but this time it backed away slightly, as if unsure of whether to attack. Taking the chance, I lunged out of the tent, brandishing the hatchet and yelling at the top of my lungs. The dog retreated further, its snarls growing fainter as it moved into the shadows. I kept the flashlight trained on it until it disappeared into the trees, its glowing eyes the last thing I saw before it vanished completely. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Instead, I sat by the tent with the hatchet in one hand and the flashlight in the other, jumping at every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started the hike back to the trailhead. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less threatening, almost peaceful again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me from the underbrush. But there was nothing, just the quiet rustle of the wind through the trees. When I finally reached my car, I tossed my gear into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I drove away, I couldn't help but wonder what I'd encountered out there. A sick, feral dog? Maybe. But the way it moved, the way it watched me, it felt wrong, like it wasn't just an animal. I haven't been camping since. Every now and then, I'll think about that night, about the silence and the growling and the way those eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness. And every time, I remind myself that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Whatever it was, it stayed in the woods where it belonged, and that's good enough for me. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the woods became as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was my second night out here, a solo camping trip that I'd planned as a way to reset my mind. Life had been overwhelming lately, and I thought some time alone with nature would be the perfect way to clear my head. The campsite I chose was about 5 miles from the nearest road, deep in a forest where the trees grew so close together that the sunlight barely touched the ground during the day. I had a fire going, not large but enough to keep me warm and provide some light. My small tent was set up about 10 feet away, and my gear was neatly packed inside. I sat on a log, staring into the flames, listening to the crackling of the wood. It was peaceful at first. The air was crisp, and the stars were starting to peek through the gaps in the canopy above. I felt a rare sense of calm, the kind you can only find far away from the noise of the world. But then I noticed the silence. If you've spent any time outdoors, you know the forest is never truly quiet. There's always the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, or the distant calls of animals. But now it was as if everything had stopped. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the faint crackle of the fire. I tried to brush it off. Maybe the animals had settled down for the night, or maybe I was just overthinking it. But then I heard something. A faint rustling in the distance, coming from the direction of the trees behind me. At first, I thought it might be a deer or a raccoon. I had seen plenty of tracks earlier in the day, and it wasn't uncommon for wildlife to wander near campsites. But this sounded different. It wasn't the quick, light steps of a deer or the scurrying of a raccoon. It was slower, heavier, like something large was moving deliberately through the brush. I turned my head, squinting into the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. My flashlight was in the tent, but I didn't want to move just yet. The sound stopped as soon as I shifted, and I began to feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me again. I told myself it was nothing. The forest is full of strange noises, and most of them are harmless. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I had been looking forward to this solo camping trip for months. The idea of spending a weekend disconnected from the world, surrounded by nothing but nature, was exactly what I needed. I loaded up my gear: a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food, a first aid kit, and my flashlight with extra batteries. I chose a spot far off the beaten path, in the woods near a state park where the trails weren't overly trafficked. This was going to be my escape. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. I parked my car at the edge of the gravel road, grabbed my gear, and started hiking. The air was crisp, with the smell of pine and earth filling my lungs. The occasional bird call or rustling of leaves under my boots kept me grounded. It was peaceful. About 2 hours into the hike, I found a small clearing near a brook. It was perfect. Flat ground for the tent and a reliable water source nearby. I set up camp, arranged my things, and made a small fire as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The night was calm. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. With a compass and a map tucked into my pocket, I ventured further into the woods. The canopy above was dense, letting in scattered beams of sunlight that danced on the forest floor. I spotted deer tracks, a few squirrels, and even a hawk circling high above. It wasn't until late afternoon that I saw it. A cabin. It was tucked deep in the trees, barely visible unless you were close. The structure looked old, decades old at least. The wood was dark and rotting in places, with vines snaking up the sides. The roof sagged slightly, and one of the windows was boarded up. Something about it immediately made me uneasy, but I was curious. I approached cautiously, stepping over a rusted metal trap that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The closer I got, the stronger the smell became. It was faint at first, but as I neared the cabin, it became almost unbearable. The stench of rot and decay hung thick in the air. I stopped about 20 feet away, my stomach churning. That's when I saw the pile. It was to the left of the cabin, near a half-collapsed shed. A mound of dead animals, rabbits, squirrels, a couple of deer, piled together haphazardly. Flies buzzed around it, and I could see the exposed bones of some that had already been picked clean. I froze, trying to process what I was seeing. Who would do something like this? Hunters wouldn't just leave carcasses out like that. And the state of decay suggested they'd been there for weeks, maybe longer. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't stop myself from moving closer. The cabin door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed against it. I peered inside. The interior was dark, but the faint light that seeped in through the cracks showed more signs of neglect. Broken furniture, cobwebs, and scattered debris. On the floor near the entrance, I saw what looked like a set of muddy boot prints leading further inside. I couldn't bring myself to go in. As I backed away, I noticed something else. A trail of dried blood leading from the pile of animals to the cabin door. My stomach turned again, and I quickly decided I had seen enough. I retraced my steps back to my camp as quickly as I could, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I felt watched, though I didn't see or hear anything unusual. Back at camp, I packed up my gear in record time. The plan was to head back to my car and leave, but as I started down the trail, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Boot prints. They were fresh and they weren't mine. My heart raced. I scanned the area, gripping the small knife I always carried on hikes. There was no one in sight, but the prints were headed in the direction of my camp. I didn't wait to find out who they belonged to. I moved quickly, almost jogging back toward the trailhead. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. The forest, once peaceful, now felt oppressive. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the back seat and jumped in. The engine roared to life, and I sped off without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles away, safely on a main road, that I began to feel a sense of relief. The cabin, the pile of animals, the boot prints, it was all behind me now. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who had left those animals there? Was it some kind of ritual? A deranged hunter? And the boot prints? Had someone been watching me the whole time? I reported the cabin and the animal pile to the park rangers anonymously. They said they'd check it out, but I never followed up. I didn't want to know what they found or if they found anything at all. The woods no longer feel like an escape. I haven't been camping since. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The sound of leaves rustling, louder than usual, broke through my sleep like a sharp knock on my consciousness. For a moment, I just lay there in my sleeping bag, disoriented and unsure if I was still dreaming. The inside of the tent was pitch black, the kind of darkness you only get deep in the woods, far from city lights. I had pitched my tent earlier that evening near the edge of a clearing, surrounded by dense trees on 3 sides. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but it was my first time in this particular area. I had chosen this spot because it was secluded and quiet, perfect for unwinding from the chaos of daily life. The day had been uneventful. I spent most of it setting up camp, hiking around the area, and cooking a simple meal on my portable stove. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped, and I retreated into my tent earlier than I usually would. The forest had felt peaceful, almost too quiet, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Now, lying there in the dark, I felt anything but peaceful. The sound of movement came again, faint but deliberate. It wasn't the random noise of an animal scurrying through the underbrush. It was slow, measured footsteps. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that it drowned out everything else. I strained to listen, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But there it was again, the unmistakable crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot, circling my tent. I couldn't see anything from where I was lying, but I didn't dare move. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but it was turned off to conserve the battery. My flashlight was within arm's reach, but the thought of turning it on and alerting whoever or whatever was out there felt like a terrible idea. I stayed as still as possible, every muscle in my body tense, as the footsteps grew closer. They were uneven, like someone limping or trying to move quietly but failing. Whoever it was, they were walking slowly, circling my tent. For what felt like an eternity, I listened. The footsteps would stop for a few seconds and then resume, moving closer and then farther away, as if the person or thing was deciding what to do next. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it another camper, park ranger, a hunter, or worse, someone with bad intentions? I had no way of knowing, and that uncertainty was worse than anything. At one point, the footsteps stopped directly in front of the tent. My breath hitched, and I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping whoever it was would just leave. But then I heard a faint noise, something brushing against the fabric of the tent. It took every ounce of willpower not to scream. I wanted to call out, ask who was there, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. Instead, I lay there, paralyzed, as the sound of fingers or something dragged lightly along the side of the tent. The noise moved from one corner to the next,